Welcome to the Calm Analytics channel. I'm Boris Tiesenghausen. Today is October 10th, and we have a lot of important news. In this episode, a massive strike on Ukraine. Putin wants to leave an entire country without electricity and heat. Ukraine's response will come soon, and it will be unexpected for Russia. Aliyev made Putin apologize for the first time in 25 years. So what happened? And there's a major scandal in Europe. Hungary is spying on officials of the European Union. It's time for Donald Trump to take action, and also about how Medvedev went to North Korea to watch gymnasts, while it turns out that the son of Putin's press secretary Peskov is fighting in the Maldives. All this and more in today's episode. There will be a lot of interesting things, so if you're new to the channel, subscribe so you don't miss the next episodes. So, a massive attack on Ukraine last night. The Russians used more than 450 attack drones and over 30 missiles. They targeted the energy infrastructure, thermal power plants, and gas infrastructure. Well, right now in some regions, emergency power outages are in effect, and there are disruptions with water supply. The main goal is to leave Ukrainian cities without water, electricity, and heat. And also to break the spirit of Ukrainian resistance in order to pressure the country's leadership into accepting the terms of the Russian Federation. Just imagine Vladimir Putin, who proudly declared, "I am launching this so-called special military operation, fully confident and absolutely certain that Kiev would fall very, very quickly." And now this same Putin is doing everything to cut off electricity and heat to kindergartens, schools, maternity wards, and hospitals in Ukrainian cities in order to exert pressure on the country's leadership. This is the same man who wanted to take Ukraine in just a few days. Do you remember what this reminds me of? In this case, Putin is taking an entire country hostage. Remember when various terrorist organizations would bring out hostages, film everything on video? There would be people standing with weapons. The hostages might have their eyes blindfolded or a bag put over their heads. I'm not saying we will execute the hostage after a certain time if you don't meet our conditions, like ceasefire, some concessions, release our terrorist friends, and so on. And this is exactly the same thing, only now Putin has, well, at least he thinks so, taken the entire population of Ukraine hostage and says, either I leave them without heat and electricity, and then you accept my terms. Just think about it. Bin Laden killed 3,000 people in the 9/11 terrorist attack. And he was hunted all over the world until he was eliminated. Putin kills hundreds of thousands of people, and people shake his hand and take pride in having good relations with him. Well then, speaking of those who shake his hand, hello, where are the international organizations? Where are all these UN structures? Because attacks on vital civilian infrastructure are a violation of international humanitarian law. It is 200% classified as a war crime, especially if the attacks are large scale, as in this case. Let me remind you, Putin, now we are approaching this date, has carried out large-scale, deliberately punitive actions. That's exactly what they are doing now. And let me remind you, this is not the first attack. Today is October 10th. Exactly on this date, in 2022, Russia for the first time launched a massive strike on critical infrastructure across all of Ukraine. In other words, they're also obsessed with symbolism. On this same date in 2022, the first massive shelling of critical infrastructure took place. They're completely out of their minds over there. That's the truth. They've lost it for the 10th time already. Russia has been trying to cause a blackout and has been at it for 3 years now. I've lost count of how many attempts this is already. I remember those times as if it was in a past life. Well, probably anyone from Ukraine will understand what I mean. You walk down the street and the whole place is rattling with generators. There's just this constant noise everywhere. Everyone is trying to adjust to the schedule somehow. You immediately develop the skill of not using the elevator because anything can happen, and then suddenly everything just shuts down. But I remember it, the blackout schedules, we all went through that. I don't know, what do they expect to achieve now? That now we'll say, yeah, we didn't give up 3 times, but of course on the 4th try we'll break, of course. And I want to say that our energy workers, utility workers, and emergency responders did a great job. Whenever possible, they restored everything quickly back then. And I think that now it will be just as fast. They are restoring everything, and I want to take this opportunity to thank them for their hard work, especially when you know that you're up against a real terrorist. Still, the Russians used terrorist tactics specifically against our energy workers, and yet they kept repairing things, risking their lives. You know what they did? What the Russians did was strike the energy infrastructure, wait for a while until the repair crews arrived, and then strike again when those who were fixing the facility were already there. They wanted to take out the specialists so that there would be no one left to do the repairs. They're sick. This is terrorism to the extreme, plain and simple. Sometimes you're just amazed at how much Putin's Russia repeats the actions of Nazi Germany. It feels like Putin found some personal handbook of Hitler's, studied it thoroughly, and then started following it step by step. In other words, when there's a massive shelling of Ukraine, I think this isn't the first time in history. This is how it's always been. For example, Germany, when it bombed London 57 days in a row, that operation called the Blitzkrieg. They bombed, wiped everything off the face of the earth. Thousands and thousands of people died, but still they didn't break. Russians need to remember that after London there were Hamburg and Dresden, German cities that, yes, there's a lot of debate now about whether the response was proportionate or not, but there was a response. That's why Ukraine also has something to respond with now. So I think that, but we're not like that, for one thing. When we strike, if we do, it's at oil refineries that directly impact the military budget and bring money into it. We strike at military targets, yes, we do. And actually, by the way, let me reveal an open secret to Russians. Nothing would be flying your way if Putin hadn't started the war. It's not those damned Ukrainians, Ukro-Saxons and so on, Satanists, anarchists. They're not to blame. Why do you even care how people lived in this country? Clean up your very own entryways, meticulously build your own roads, and then perhaps you definitely won't feel like going to war. By the way, here's something interesting. When the Luftwaffe was bombing London, Stalin was supplying Hitler with steel and wheat. At that time, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was still in effect. It was only later that Hitler attacked with Operation Barbarossa. But in fact, the bread German pilots ate was Soviet, and the bombs that fell on Britain were made from Soviet steel. But of course, you won't find this in Russian history textbooks. It's considered shameful to talk about it. In those Russian textbooks, the Soviet Union practically defeated Hitler single-handedly, and the fact that trains were being sent and that Hitler's Germany was being supplied from the Soviet Union right up until the start of what Russia calls the Great Patriotic War. This is important to know. Well, I don't know what more reasons Donald Trump would need to impose sanctions to finally start acting against the paper rat. Maybe Putin would have to literally start bombing hospitals and maternity wards. But he's already doing that. Not so long ago in Sumy, a few days ago, a Shahed drone made a direct hit on a maternity hospital. And remember Okmadit and many, many others. Hospitals, maternity wards, kindergartens, entire apartment buildings completely destroyed. Now imagine, for those who aren't in Ukraine, imagine you're living at a time when, well, it seems like you're in the modern world. People are already planning to fly to Mars. There's ChatG5. But you live and you have the internet, but every day you go, the air raid siren goes off, or it goes off at night, and you realize that at any moment a missile could just hit your home. So this is how you've been living for the 4th year now. In Europe, for example. Can you even imagine that? It's hard to imagine. I recall my great-grandmother's phrase, "If only no war." I'd ask, "Well, Grandma, what war?" She'd reply, "It's gone far away." It was gone, but now the followers of Hitler have hatched out of these Botox larvae. Well, another important point is the response. Ukraine does have something to respond with, that's true. The question is in choosing the targets. You could just as well try to respond in kind in the Kursk or Belgorod regions, shut down those regions. There are means to do it, really, so they could feel it themselves. Belgorod has already recently gotten a taste of this response. But here's a very important point. Putin doesn't care about the residents of the Kursk and Belgorod regions. He just doesn't care at all. They're warm and comfortable, whether they have electricity or not, and so on. He doesn't even give money for housing repairs. That governor appointed by Putin, Kinshin, he says, "Are you crazy or what? We're at war. Everything goes to the war. Get out of here. All of you peasants. How dare you even petition the Tsar?" So that's how it is. He just doesn't care. Of course, we would like Russians to feel it for themselves, but even more, we want this war to end justly. We honestly don't care how they live over there, right? We don't want anything that isn't ours. We'll take back what's ours, but we don't need anything that belongs to others. And it seems to me that if you have to choose between refineries and ports or making Russians feel something, then of course, in my personal opinion, and by the way, you can disagree in the comments. So oil refineries, gas processing plants, oil pipelines, gas pipelines, and most importantly, ports, these are the priority targets. Every refinery that is shut down is like turning off a tap from which money flows into the military budget. Directly. And as for the ports, well, the ports are where the death of Koshai is hidden. When the fuel shortage becomes catastrophic, when there's nothing left to process and nowhere to ship from, then you can start sending greetings to Muscovites. Some people say we need to make their lives hell. Let me remind you, they're already in hell. They were born in Russia. And as for whether there will be a response, don't even doubt it. Yesterday, another significant event happened that showed Putin's current place in the food chain. Old man Kabayev was basically forced to apologize to Aliyev and Azerbaijan. This is a very important precedent. It's clear what he was mumbling about. Let me remind you what he had to apologize for. The downed Azerbaijani airliner. It was shot down by a Russian air defense missile. At first, the Russian side lied, refused to let the plane land, sent it off somewhere to Kazakhstan and elsewhere. They lied, saying first that a gas cylinder had exploded on board, then that some birds had gotten into the engines, even though from the very beginning they knew it was their air defense missile. So Putin refused to apologize, while Aliyev demanded an apology, punishment for those responsible, and for Russia to at least acknowledge that it happened. And the Russian side refused. Well, that's just... But now, Putin suddenly decided to apologize. And I watched that meeting. Putin was, well, he's already a dwarf, about 1.5 meters tall, but he was also kind of hunching over like this. Aliyev, on the other hand, looked confident as he sat there. Honestly, the expression on his face was like he was looking at, excuse me, talking crap. But what can you do? What can you do? So Putin was mumbling about how they were shooting down Ukrainian drones, that it was an accident, that no one was to blame, just a technical failure of the air defense system itself. And he apologized for the tragedy happening in Russian airspace. But what happened, you want to ask? And why didn't he apologize right away? Moreover, let me remind you, friends, he not only didn't apologize, he even acted tough, like a typical thug. So there was a serious incident involving members of the Azerbaijani diaspora in Russia. 2 people were beaten to death during an interrogation there. Then there was a retaliatory incident in Azerbaijan, and things started escalating around the Russian propagandists from that satellite channel. So basically, Putin kept raising the stakes, raising the tension, and now I'm supposed to apologize? But suddenly he rushed to apologize. And do you know what that means? This is a precedent, a moment when the rules of the game have changed. Moscow, which for decades dictated the terms to all its neighbors, for the first time capitulated, let me emphasize, under direct pressure from Azerbaijan. In other words, Azerbaijan, relying on Turkey's growing influence, forced the Kremlin to admit its guilt. And there's another point. Aliyev also demanded that those responsible be punished. So what about that? Well, we'll see. So what's going on, Russians? Explain to me, is your aging leader already losing steam? So where is Putin, who now, he ran off to apologize just now? In fact, he could have done it right away, but that's not how it's done. That's not how real men act. Real men don't apologize, right? And also, the European Parliament adopted a resolution calling on EU countries to shoot down Russian planes in their airspace. Now, the resolution is advisory in nature, but you see, they've cornered the paper rat from all sides. So it turns out, Azerbaijan didn't cave in. Not everyone in Europe is capitulating either. Yes, of course, we would like to see more decisiveness, but still, it's another resolution. The European Parliament called on the West to allow Ukraine to strike targets in Russia with Western weapons without restrictions. That's also a good move, but calling for it is one thing, actually giving them the means to strike is even better. That's even better. I always repeat this. By the way, friends, let me remind you about an important fundraiser we have for the 101st Brigade to get termite ground robotic systems, which evacuate our wounded defenders and help save their lives. They transport them farther back to where medics can already work with them. This way, the medics themselves don't have to risk their lives as they used to when going out to retrieve our defenders. And it's really needed, especially on the front lines when the Russians are pushing along the entire front. Yes, maybe they're not doing so well, but ground unmanned evacuation vehicles are absolutely essential for our fighters. The 101st Brigade recorded an appeal to us. Please take a look.
We, the soldiers of the 101st Security Brigade, are reaching out to Boris Tizengauzin and his followers for help. We are very grateful to you for the drones you have previously provided. At present, we are in urgent need of 2 termite ground robotic systems for the rapid and timely evacuation of wounded soldiers from the battlefield, which, in the current situation, will help save their lives. Our units are fighting in the Kostiantynivka direction and in Chasiv Yar. We continue to destroy the enemy and believe in
A donation for an evacuation vehicle for the wounded is a direct investment in saving lives. And I always want to say a huge thank you to everyone who helps. The link to donate is in the description of this video, and there's also a link in the comments. There you'll find private, mono, and PayPal for those who want to help from abroad. I see all of you, and I want to say a huge thank you from myself and from our defenders. But let's help them together. If you don't see the payment details, there's a QR code as well. It also leads to the donation page. And let me remind you, friends, the Kremlin's official threat maker and Putin's battle-picking geese, Medvedev, is currently in North Korea attending the 80th anniversary celebration of the Workers' Party of Korea. Today I came across some footage from there. What a classic Soviet throwback. At the stadium, in honor of this 80th anniversary of the Workers' Party, they showed mass gymnastic performances for Kim Jong-un. Medvedev even appeared in one of the photos. He's just walking, everyone else is going one way, and he seems to be drifting off in another direction. I mean, I don't know, maybe he's wandering around looking for little bottles of booze. You know, like in a video game where the character runs around collecting coins. Except he's after shot glasses and cups. He just runs around knocking them back until he turns into some kind of half-liquid Terminator. By the way, on the website of the Korean Central News Agency, there's a speech and a photo, but it's impossible to read. The words of the great Kim Jong-un, there are just billions of words there. And if I'm already on the Korean Central News Agency website, of course, you're not getting out of here without a story from Kim Jong-un's life. Well, it's not a simple story. Now I'm going to tell you about it. In the meantime, make sure to subscribe to this channel, don't forget. You're watching calm, thoughtful analysis. By the way, one Putin supporter accidentally watched some calm analysis, and the next morning he was found with his TV turned off and critical thinking skills. So subscribe, friends, it helps promote the truth and fight against evil. So here's a story from Kim Jong-un's life on the official website. Let me remind you, on this website of the Central Telegraph Agency, every little sneeze by Kim Jong-un is turned into a glorious revolutionary episode. In fact, there's even a section called Revolutionary Episode. Even if Kim Jong-un just stumbles a bit, I think it would be featured there. Face down into the ground, they would write that it was simply a revolutionary episode. I don't know, something like the great leader suddenly fell and kissed his native land. He always does that. So the story from the official website is called, Why Didn't He Take His Eyes Off the Sea of Apples? This is the original. One day in September 2017, respected comrade Kim Jong-un visited Quail County after receiving a report that the county had harvested a rich crop of apples despite unfavorable natural and climatic conditions. So, comrade Kim Jong-un, looking over the sea of apples, he asked the responsible county official what the average yield was. He was given an answer. Gladly listening to the determination of the county official, Kim Jong-un expressed great satisfaction. He spent a long time looking at the orchard plots and then headed to the Fruit Research Institute. And now we arrive here. One of the people accompanying him, an employee, told Comrade Kim Jong-un that he had worked too much and that it was already lunchtime. Then Kim Jong-un said that he didn't feel like eating after seeing the bountiful fruit harvest. It seems that the fatigue has lifted, and I truly don't want to leave. This, just imagine, is a story, a revolutionary episode, as it's called. So basically, all the stories there are just like that. I don't know, maybe he just had a dozen chebureks and a boiled pig's head for breakfast, washed down with some kind of oil under the sun. That's probably why he doesn't want to eat. You can tell just by looking at him that that's pretty much how he eats. And the more catastrophic the situation becomes for the Russian economy, the more aggressive and brazen Putin will act, realizing that he has less and less time and money left for this war. And so, following the coal industry in Russia, a crisis is beginning in the metallurgical industry. The worst crisis since the 90s. Russian metallurgical plants have started layoffs due to a collapse in demand and production. Let me remind you that the metallurgical sector is one of the key non-resource industries, accounting for almost 20% of all industrial production in the country. A 10 trillion ruble hole in the budget. Entire industries are collapsing. Loss of foreign markets. Now they also have to sell oil and gas at a steep discount, and there are new sanctions. And on top of that, there's the war, which is devouring enormous resources. This is a special case. Because a financial crisis, if we were just talking about a financial crisis, it's serious, but it's not the death of the entire state. We've been through financial crises before, more than once. But the financial crisis combined with a lost war. Add to that the collapse of ideology, which, I remind you, barely exists in Russia at all, and the post-war crisis of power, and the crisis in the country after the war, which is inevitable. And that's when you get detonation and an explosion. That's when you get detonation. History knows many such examples. Imperial Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, the USSR, by the way. The USSR also collapsed after losing the war in Afghanistan against the backdrop of falling oil prices. But the lost war in Afghanistan, compared to what's happening today, was child's play. In other words, the consequences of this war for Russia will be far more devastating. And now we have news that was to be expected, but well, in general, it was. The European Commission will launch an investigation into Hungary over reports of espionage within European Union institutions. Wow! The European Commission is launching an internal investigation. There have been reports of possible espionage by Hungarian intelligence services against European Union institutions and their staff. Well, there you have it. A group is being formed now and they will investigate. What happened? A journalistic investigation by 3 major publications has revealed that Hungary's Foreign Intelligence Service set up a spy network in Brussels to conduct intelligence activities against European Union institutions. And most importantly, the Hungarian EU Commissioner, Várhelyi, could have known about it, and most likely did. Wow. How did that happen? So what's going on over there in the European Union? Is everything all right with you? You have Orban, who blocks the decisions of all the other countries, blocks aid to Ukraine, blocks anti-Russian sanctions, lifts sanctions from Russian oligarchs. In other words, he directly lobbies for Russia's interests, even better than Russia itself lobbies for its interests in the European Union. And now Hungarian services are also spying on European institutions and politicians. How is that even possible? And now, the most interesting part. I read up on this European Commissioner. Do you know what his position is? So in 2020, I see a news story. Why? I googled him, looked at a photo. How is that? Standing next to him is Kuleba, our former Minister of Foreign Affairs. There's also Honcharuk, the former Prime Minister, if anyone still remembers him. I'm looking at the photo and thinking, what is this? And it turns out this Oliver visited Kiev back in 2020, according to the archives. Do you know in what capacity? He was the European Commissioner for Enlargement of the European Union. In other words, to put it simply, his area of responsibility is Ukraine and 15 other countries that are neighbors of the European Union, and also Turkey and the Western Balkans. So a Hungarian official who is involved in a scandal about intelligence gathering by Hungarian intelligence was in charge of EU enlargement issues. Let me remind you, Orban is the main opponent of Ukraine's accession to the EU. In other words, it's like putting a fox in charge of the henhouse. And recently, by the way, there was a case when a Russian took the position of head of the counterterrorism office at the United Nations. A Russian became Guterres' deputy in this area in the fight against terrorism. Again, it's like having a fox guard the henhouse. Maybe it's time, maybe it's time to appoint someone from the Taliban as the head of the Office for Women's Rights, huh? Have you ever thought about that idea? And here, Putin's press secretary Peskov had a real embarrassment. His son, who supposedly served with the Wagner PMC at the front, received a medal. It turned out that during the months he was supposed to be serving with the Wagner PMC, he was actually vacationing in the Maldives. That's how it happened. That can't be right? No, that just can't be. Could it really be that Russian officials vacation outside of Russia? Could it really be that they own property abroad? Could it really be that they have money in Switzerland or Belgium or maybe somewhere in the Emirates? Does that mean they're not patriots? No, that just can't be. By the way, why didn't Peskov's son vacation in Anapa or Sochi? It's a very typical story, but they haven't checked Kadyrov's son yet. He already has about 30 different medals and orders. And he was given a watch worth $7 million as a wedding present. By the way, it's probably time to give him a medal for not having received any medals in a while. Someone isn't doing their job. When I saw Kadyrov's son dancing in a tracksuit with a gold pistol on his belt on the stage of some cultural palace and the whole audience was applauding, I realized, well, it's just such barbarism. It's like some kind of mafia boss rule. What do you think? Will he become a general by the age of 20 or not? Or will he be given the rank of General Admiral right away? So that he commands both the ground forces and, the Navy? Well, maybe he's actually talented and here I am just bad-mouthing him. Why shouldn't he be talented? After all, his father is an academician, for what it's worth. Well, friends, take care of yourselves and your loved ones. Subscribe to this channel. Let's support the fundraiser for our soldiers from the 101st Brigade. They really need this help right now. Wishing us all a peaceful day and glory to Ukraine.